Okay, happy Halloween, everyone. I'm gonna continue reading The Devil in Massachusetts, chapter 21, Village Purge. While Cotton Mather was fighting off the devil in Boston, Salem Village was pulling itself together after its ordeal. It was not altogether unlike returning to the community, which had been sacked by Indians and trying to pick up life again, except that it was in some ways more difficult. The moral effect of purely physical disaster may be cleansing. When men unite against nature and a common enemy, they may keep their dignity even in ruin. But through this thing which had passed had left the houses standing and the fields untouched. It had brought division and a sore sickness of spirit on the people. Husband had broken charity, and wife with husband. Mother with child, and child with mother. Even worse had been the tattling of neighbor against neighbor. Relationship in so small a community are organic, no matter what the petty jar of day-to-day collision. There must be in a crisis a community of sympathy and understanding, else there is no health. And here was little health. Not in the generation would it be forgotten how neighbor had responded with spite to a neighbor's need. Even the many who had kept their integrity, who had spoken out for a friend in danger, had little peace of mind. What they had seen had been corrosive for their faith. Malice had been exalted above charity, and the idle words of a pack of undisciplined girls allowed to outweigh whole lifetimes of decency and good faith. If such were the will of God, what wonder there so many had turned to the devil. It is, if so blasphemous, a thought that was openly expressed, at least its corollary was God could not have willed such a thing, but not God, but the devil had been in command here. Their leaders had suffered the devil to guide them. They were turning from such leaders. In particular, they were turning from the leadership of the Reverend Samuel Parris. The January trials of 1963 were hardly over, when a meeting was held in Salem Village to make void their pastor's salary. Not even the late George Burroughs had been during his ministry so directly attacked. The congregation had not voided his salary, but had simply neglected to pay it. It was remarkable. What was remarkable about this act was it took place only 5 months after Parrish had been able to get unanimous approval for his congregation to excommunicate Martha Corey. Either this had been the sort of unanimity that would not bear close scrutiny, or the vote merely demonstrated the personal unpopularity of Martha, who was, after all, an opinionated woman. Besides being married to the trouble-making Gallows, the disinclination to pay Paris was not necessarily born of enmity alone. Money was hard to come by now. The witch hunt, coinciding with the seasons of planting and harvesting, had cast an economic blight over the community. Everyone suffered, even the officials. Hence, Marshal George Herrick was complaining to Governor Phipps that in 9 months of almost incessant labor in connection with the witch hunt, he had been unable to do for his poor farm, and was now literally in want of enough provision to get through the winter. I am become despicable in these hard times. Even in Boston, business had almost come to a standstill. During the peak of the excitement, Government Phipps had reported to England the urgency of getting the matter settled if the legislators were ever again to attend to anything but the witchcraft. How much more was this true of Salem Village, where there was hardly a family but had a personal stake in the affair. Besides, there have been the doubt. Besides, there have been the drought, and now, as if the yield were not lean enough, came the demand for hard cash to pay the jail fees as one after another of the witches was discharged. Even so great the needs and so little to do with the village could hardly support a church. The pastor had his own field and orchard. Let him live off them as the rest were trying to do. But one could not dismiss the responsibility so lightly, nor was that sharp bargainer Paris one to forgive his salary while his parishioners recouped their losses. By December, he had secured a court order to the effect that people refused to pay their rates would have to stand suit. Before that order came, however, other troubles, evidence of uh, irreconcilable differences between pastor and flock, had come into the open. There were some for whom non payment rates was the least of the matter. They simply would not set foot in the church so long as it was Paris who occupied the pulpit. The said Paris reported these in a plea to the court April 1693, had been teaching some dangerous errors and preached such scandalous immoralities as ought to discharge him, though even so gifted otherwise, for the work of the minister. His claim that prisoners had knocked down those pretended sufferers with a look they charged was swearing to more than he was certain of, and hence he was equally guilty of perjury with them that swear to what is false. He is believing the devil's accusations and readily departing from all charity to persecute the blameless and godly lives are just causes for our refusal. Mr. Paris has been the beginning and procurer of the sorest affliction, not to the village, but to the whole country. Was it just they asked that they should honor, respect, and support such an instrument to our miseries? The court did not honor the petition. Its signers, Joseph Putnam and three kinsmen of Rebecca Nurse, were too obviously partisan, yet they were plainly gaining and ascending over the congregation. So strong the feeling was against Paris, the ministers from the neighboring towns were alarmed and urged Paris and his flock to hold a council to settle their differences. Paris himself was not impervious to the charge of moral climate. In an attempt to placate his enemies, he humbled himself before his congregation and read the document about the late Hort calamity, which he called mediators for peace. It was, he said, a sore rebuke that the witchcraft had come first from his own family, that unlawful means had not been taken there to raise spirits, though totally unknown to me or mine till after. I desire to lie low under this reproach and to lay my hand to my mouth. Now at last he acknowledged that God might suffer the devil to take the shape of an innocent, and hence it was wrong to ask the afflicted who afflicted another. He offered his sympathy to those who had suffered through the clouds of human weakness and Satan's wiles and sophistry. He asked pardon of God and prayed that all might be covered with the mantle of love, and we may forgive each other heartily after all the death that it has caused. Wow. I say that because it's written in quotations. So he is like actually saying this. Um, if half so much had been said formerly, Drury commented Rebecca Nurse's son in law, John Tarbell, when the document was read to him, it would never have come to this. Paris, however, was trying to placate the uh, implacable, and he had begun too late. It had been forever too late, ever since the hangman had supported Rebecca Nurse up the gallows. We, we know not how to express the loss of such a mother in such a way, said one of Rebecca's sons. Those who had not hesitated to risk their lives to save her in a time when to say one word for a witch was almost certain to draw the accusation of the girls were unlikely to forgive uh, heartedly. The man who had taken the word of delinquents against the word of a good woman, etched in bitter acid on their memories, was their mother, trembling and yet steadfast before the magistrates. Even the magistrates had wavered when she was brought before them, but not this man. They would not waver now. Not all the courts in Massachusetts could force them to worship the false shepherd who had misled his sheep. I mean, really, like, it just blows my mind that this guy was responsible for a lot of what happened because he was a pastor, and then on top of that, he, at the end of taking away people's, not only their loved ones, but uh, had a hand in making sure that the ones that were, were killed or went to prison, it really like hurt their lives, even if they were able to survive the prison, because now all of them are not even free because of the prison fees. In November 1964, Samuel Nurse and Thomas Wilkins produced yet another analysis of their motives. Their reluctance to attend Paris's church had begun in the day of the afflicted girls, when the distractions and disturbing tumults and noises had made by the persons under diabolical powers and delusions prevented sometimes our hearing and understanding and profiting of the word preached. They had been afraid to stay in such society, having heard persons better than ourselves accused, because they found Paris's preaching dark and dismal, his dwelling on mysteries of iniquity offensive. They could not in conscience join in his prayers, and above all, they had found no charity in him. That quality without a preacher's eloquence is as a surrounding brass and as a sounding brass and uh, tinkling cymbal. The the quarrel went on year after year. Once Paris offered the uh, recalcitrance demission to another parish. I, said one, if we could find a way to remove our livings too. In April 1695, a council of churches of the North Shore met in Salem to uh, arbitrate the case. The the assembled ministers agreed with the descendants that unwarranted and uh, uncomfortable steps had been taken by Paris during the dark time of confusion. Yet now that he had been brought into better sense of things, Christian charity might and should receive satisfaction. Therefore, the church must treat the dissenters with bowels as much with bowels bowls of much compassion, and the the infirmities discovered on such a heartbreaking day. But it was for the latter to reconcile themselves. If they could not, let them leave and stir up trouble in Salem village no more. They would not be reconciled, and now by the majority in the parish stood with them. Time had worked for the children of Rebecca. The spectral talk in the Boston coffee houses was getting more attention than the voices of the Miss Carters, who spoke darkly of the willful smothering of the witchcraft. If there were any here who still believed that Rebecca Nurse had been done justly to death, or John Proctor or Murray Etsy, few of them now dared to say so. It was at last parish who consented to remove on the provision that the congregation pay him heirs of I think £79, 9s, and 6d. Don't know what that is. The sum was raised with cheerful alacrity. Paris went and took with him the least guilty and most pitiful of the afflicted, little Betty, and his young son Noyes. It is to be hoped that Betty came elsewhere into sunnier days and escaped the shadow that the devil cast over her brother. For this child, born in evil time and named for the witch-hunting parson of Salem, grew to manhood only to die insane. The successor to Paris, one Joseph Green, was an unexpected choice. He was only 22 and had only within the year achieved a state of grace. Though Green had graduated from Harvard in 1695, he had not prepared for the ministry. He had been exactly the sort of student that Cotton Mather in his own undergraduate days had shrunk from. He had played cards, danced, cursed, and had often profaned the Sabbath by streaking off into the country with fishing rod and fowling piece. Light did not come to him until he was out of Harvard and teaching in the Roxbury Grammar School. There he came upon one of Cotton Mather's sermons, and never did Mather make more of an electric effect. The young man became overnight not only a convert but an evangelist, speaking of God and his kingdom in and out of season to his students, his mother, his brothers at sea, and soon to whole congregations. A city which is set on a hill is not hid. Presently, Green was being invited to preach, and the reputation of his sermons reached the Salem village. The village called him, and he came. If he, given his youth, was a surprising choice, he was a wholesome one. Perhaps it is an advantage not to send one's youth agonizing over damnation and the certainty of death. Green certainly had not, and whatever his present convictions on these subjects, they did not impair his outgoing cheerfulness. He was a pastor who got around. One found him over a mug of ale at Deacon Ingersoll's ordinary, and at the house settling his shoulders to the timber, or off with his gun to track down a bobcat or to shoot wild pigeons. He found him in Winham, where he courted the Reverend Miss Garrish, daughter Elizabeth, and took her home with him to bear him a brood of lively little boys. They were a lovely, loving pair, wrote Noyes, and had his sentimental side, and sometimes let it overflow into verse. He labored his fields and jotted down the results in a brief, extravagant diary. Very hot, thunder and rain, bugs. He badgered his congregation to set up a school and build a new meeting house. He trained with a troop of horse And when Indian trouble threatened, it was bound to periodically in those days. He shouldered his musket and rode out smartly with the best of them. These zestful activities did not take place at any sacrifice of his uh, periodical duties. Such neglect, Salem Village would not have forgiven him. Young Green grasped the essentials of the situation with a wisdom and compassion beyond his years. Like Quaker uh, Muley, he identified the true devils as the small spites and had so long embroidered the village in pretty squabbles. He saw deeper delusions in the future if the unquestionable bitterness of such people as the Noyes could not somehow be assuaged. Sorry, no. Uh, assuaged. Assuaged. To this end, he undertook the bold plan of reconciliation with the older man might have judged impossible. He reworked the seating plan of his church on a symbolic arrangement of lions and lambs. He put Samuel Nurse in the pew of Thomas Putnam, father of Anne, Rebecca Nurse's daughter, the widow Preston, in the pew of the widow Walcott, mother of Mary, and with what was remarkable, the descendants lay so unyielding with Paris accepted this arrangement. It may well be that Samuel Nurse sat many a Sunday stiff and silent beside Thomas Putnam, unwilling to acknowledge his presence by so much as a glance. But no child of Rebecca had grown up unacquainted with the heavenly wisdom of charity and forgiveness. If Rebecca, like Mary Etsy, sent forth her ghost, she sent it to underline the message of young Joseph Green to forgive, make your peace, forget. So in time, the cold steel of hatred was melted from the hearts of her sons. A great burden was lifted from them, and they sat beside their late enemy, not with averted eyes, but with pity. In truth, these had not known what they did. Green's most ambitious product for reconciliation did not succeed for a long time. As early as 1702, the young men had the temerity to ask the congregation to revoke the excommunication of Martha Coy, to restore her name to the church rolls. In 1703, he got a motion to that effect passed in church, but encountered such bitterness in town meeting that for a while he swore never to attend that function again. It was not until 1707, soon after another triumph over the forces of spite, which will be recounted, that he finally won. The spirit of Martha Coy could now sit unchallenged in meeting. In spite of these reconciliations, it would be long before Salem Village could regain the prosperity it had known before calamity came. There were farms cleared and tilled and set about the stone with black breaker labor that were reverting to wilderness for their owners who had fled in the panic and cursed the place and would not come again. Peter Cloyce had tarried only until Rebecca's sister Sarah was released. Then he shook the dust from the place from his feet and never looked back. For a century or more, some places would be shunned. It was as if people feared to break the devil from the ground. Yet many stayed, and for them at least there was peace. While the village of while the village while in the village, the children of Rebecca had been closing in on Paris. Philip English in Salem town was avenging himself on Sheriff George Corwin. But if the children of Rebecca had borne themselves with dignity, the same could not be said of English. He had, of course, suffered much in the persecution. His pious wife, ailing in prison, did not long survive her return from exile. Man. Added to the sorrows was the heavily loss uh, to his pocketbook. Indeed, malicious tongues said that this pin sharpest. When he had finally consented to flee, Sheriff Corwin had fallen upon uh, his his warvis, fallen upon his warvis, his warehouse, his many uh, gabbled house, and had seized property valued at £1,500, none of which English had recovered. In doing so, Corwin had acted strictly accordingly to the law, and not probably at least from personal animus. When the return English made trouble about the seizure in 1694, the Superior Court absolved Corwin of blame for this act, and others had declared no claim no claim could be made against him for such cause. But the sheriff died in 1697, and English had his revenge. But a petty revenge. He seized a body of Corwin from the non payment of debt. He couldn't, in the nature of things, hold it indefinitely, but he had held it enough to complicate the funeral arrangements, create a scandal, and impel Corwin's executors to pay him £60 and 3s. The spirit of Christian forgiveness did not predominate the character of Philip English. Once he got himself sued for calling Noyes a murderer, he went no more to Noyes' church and or to other infested by or to any other infested by the breed of Puritans. At long last, he was able to contribute to the founding of a church of his own, St. Peter's, but this was so late in the day, so near his death, and the poor man died deranged, that only his profit thereby was to get burial in the churchyard, safe from the hands of the Puritans. Magistrate John Hawthorne he hated to his dying day. Only on his deathbed did he forgive him the humiliations he had inflicted during the witchcraft, and then not heartily. If I get well, I'll be damned, and I forgive him. Fortunately, he died without suspecting that his line was fated to merge with the line of the hated Hawthorne and to bear its name. His only legitimate son had died before him, but he did leave daughters, and one of these, deprived of his father's choleric guidance, knew not better than to marry the son of Magistrate Hawthorne, and so found the dynasty which added a W to its name, and presently produced that remote pale flowering of the witchcraft, and haunted Nathaniel Hawthorne. And Nathaniel, in his turn, would walk the ways of Salem. Town and village and ghost would keep him company, never quiet, visible, lurking, always just beyond the corner of his eye. But he would pin them down on paper, and when he had them, he would inspect them with a kind of literary credulity. For it was with him somewhat as it was with Cotton Mather, unless to preach to the artist against the existence of witches, the very breath of the artist is witchery and magic. I I will never understand the hatred that people have for their neighbors in the village in this book. Meanwhile, claiming to love their neighbors. Let's say another chapter.